March 14, 1978. Langley, Virginia. Fluorescent lights hummed above rows of gray metal desks in the CIA's Agricultural Analysis Division. Thomas Brennan, a 34-year-old agricultural economist with a PhD from Cornell, stared at the stack of Soviet grain export reports spread across his desk, his coffee growing cold in a styrofoam cup. The numbers made no sense. Ukraine's winter wheat production for the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast had dropped 23% compared to the previous year, yet no weather anomalies had been reported. No drought, no flooding, no crop disease outbreaks documented by the USDA's foreign monitoring stations. Brennan ran his finger down the columns of data again, double-checking his arithmetic. The discrepancy remained. Probably just Soviet bookkeeping, he muttered to himself, reaching for the next report. What Brennan didn't know was that he was staring at the first signal of a massive SS-20 missile deployment that would alter the strategic balance in Europe. Within 8 months, his agricultural spreadsheets would become the most closely guarded intelligence documents in the Western world, and grain statistics would prove more valuable than satellite photographs. The CIA's Agricultural Analysis Division had existed since 1952, originally created to track Soviet food production as a measure of economic stability. By the late 1970s, the division employed 47 analysts, most of them agricultural economists and statisticians, who had never worked in traditional intelligence roles. They occupied a corner of the old headquarters building that other CIA officers jokingly called the Farm Bureau. The division's primary responsibility involved monitoring global grain markets to predict Soviet import needs, information the State Department used in trade negotiations. Nobody considered it glamorous work. Nobody thought it was really espionage. The Soviet Union had become the world's largest grain importer by 1975, purchasing between 15 and 28 million metric tons annually from the United States, Canada, and Argentina. Moscow published detailed agricultural statistics as part of its 5-year plans, data meant to demonstrate socialist efficiency to the world. Soviet planners broke down production figures by oblast, crop type, and collective farm output. They reported transportation metrics, showing how many rail cars moved grain from harvest regions to processing centers and ports. The Soviets considered this economic transparency proof that central planning worked. Western agricultural traders relied on these reports to forecast market demands. The CIA's Office of Soviet Analysis had occasionally cross-referenced agricultural data with other intelligence streams, but never systematically. The dominant intelligence methods of the late Cold War focused on technical collection, satellites, signals intercepts, human sources with access to military facilities. The KH-11 reconnaissance satellite, operational since December 1976, could photograph Soviet territory with unprecedented clarity, resolving objects as small as 6 inches across. Why would anyone need to study grain statistics when you could literally see missile silos from space? Thomas Brennan had joined the CIA in 1974, recruited directly from his doctoral program, where he had specialized in Soviet agricultural policy. He spoke fluent Russian, had spent a summer in 1971 studying at Moscow State University, and understood the Byzantine structure of kolkhoz and sovkhoz farming operations. His dissertation had analyzed the systemic inefficiencies in Soviet grain distribution networks. The CIA hired him to improve their crop yield forecasting models, work that helped American grain companies negotiate better prices with Soviet trade delegations. It was economics, not espionage. At least that's what Brennan had thought. The Dnipropetrovsk discrepancy troubled Brennan throughout March 1978. He pulled historical data going back to 1970, creating detailed spreadsheets that tracked the oblast production patterns. Dnipropetrovsk had been remarkably consistent, producing between 2.1 and 2.4 million metric tons of winter wheat annually. The region's black soil and moderate climate made it one of Ukraine's most reliable grain producers. The 1977 harvest should have yielded approximately 2.3 million metric tons based on weather patterns and planted acreage. Instead, Soviet reports claimed only 1.77 million metric tons had been harvested. More than 500,000 metric tons had simply vanished. Brennan brought the anomaly to his supervisor, Dorothy Archer, a 52-year-old former USDA analyst who had spent 15 years tracking Soviet agriculture. Archer had worked on early warning systems for Soviet grain purchases, helping predict when Moscow would enter international markets. She glanced at Brennan's spreadsheets, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "Could be statistical manipulation," she said. "They might be stockpiling for a bad year they see coming, or hiding inefficiency in the 5-year plan numbers." "That's what I thought," Brennan replied. "But look at the railcar data." He slid another document across her desk. Transportation of grain from Dnepropetrovsk to processing centers dropped 19%. But rail traffic through the oblast only dropped 8% overall. Something else is using those rail cars. Archer studied the numbers for several minutes. The fluorescent lights flickered above them. Outside the window, March rain fell on the Virginia woods surrounding Langley. Pull data for other oblasts, she finally said. See if there are similar patterns elsewhere. Over the next 6 weeks, Brennan analyzed agricultural data from 47 Soviet oblasts and autonomous republics. He discovered similar anomalies in 4 other regions: Perm Oblast in the Urals, Kostroma Oblast northeast of Moscow, Chita Oblast in Siberia, and Grodno Oblast in Belarus. Each location showed the same pattern. Grain production dropped between 18 and 27% without corresponding weather events or crop failures. Rail transportation patterns showed increased non-agricultural traffic. In 3 of the 5 regions, Soviet reports indicated infrastructure development projects without providing specifics. What Brennan didn't know was that each of these oblasts housed newly constructed or expanded SS-20 Sabre missile bases. The SS-20, designated RSD-10 Pioneer by Soviet forces, represented the most advanced mobile intermediate-range ballistic missile system in the world. Each missile carried 3 independently targetable warheads with a range of 5,000 kilometers, sufficient to strike any European NATO capital from launch sites deep inside Soviet territory. The Politburo had authorized a massive expansion of SS-20 deployments in 1976, a decision that remained highly classified. Construction of the bases required thousands of workers, enormous quantities of concrete and steel, and complete transportation networks to support mobile launchers. The Soviet military commandeered rail cars, diverted construction materials, and requisitioned farmland for security perimeters around launch sites. Collective farms lost workers to construction battalions. Grain harvest suffered because nobody was left to bring in the crops. Dorothy Archer forwarded Brennan's analysis to the Office of Soviet Analysis on April 28, 1978. She attached a memo suggesting that agricultural disruptions might indicate military construction activity. The memo sat in an inbox for 3 weeks before Robert Kendall, a 41-year-old intelligence officer specializing in Soviet strategic forces, read it during a slow afternoon. Kendall had spent 7 years analyzing satellite photographs of Soviet ICBM fields. He knew every SS-18 silo location by memory, could identify construction activity from shadows and earthwork patterns. He found the agricultural analysis intriguing but speculative. Interesting thought, he wrote in reply. We'll cross-reference with imagery intelligence. The National Photographic Interpretation Center, located in Building 213 at the Washington Navy Yard, maintained the government's archive of satellite photographs. Kendall requested KH-11 imagery for all 5 oblasts Brennan had identified, focusing on the 18-month period from January 1977 through June 1978. The images arrived in early June, high-resolution photographs that showed Soviet territory in remarkable detail. Kendall spread them across his desk, studying each frame with a magnifying loupe. Perm Oblast showed new road construction in a forested area 47 kilometers northwest of the city of Perm. The roads formed a distinctive pattern, 3 parallel routes connected by perpendicular access ways, exactly the layout used for SS-20 mobile launcher dispersal areas. Kendall felt his pulse quicken. He pulled imagery from January 1977. The forest had been undisturbed. By September 1977, clear-cut areas appeared. By March 1978, the road network was complete, and rectangular shapes indicated prefabricated buildings. This was a missile base, a new one that hadn't existed 18 months earlier. Kendall spent the next 4 days examining imagery from the other oblasts Brennan had identified. Kostroma Oblast revealed a similar facility under construction near the town of Bai. Chita Oblast showed expanded infrastructure around an existing military facility that satellite analysts had previously classified as a conventional army base. Grodno Oblast displayed new construction that matched SS-20 deployment patterns. Only Dnipropetrovsk resisted immediate identification. The construction there appeared to be hardened facilities, possibly silo-based systems rather than mobile launchers. On June 9, 1978, Kendall walked to the Agricultural Analysis Division with a folder of satellite photographs. He found Thomas Brennan at his desk, surrounded by Soviet agricultural reports and calculator tape. Your grain data was right, Kendall said, without preamble. All 5 locations show military construction. Major facilities. This is big. Brennan looked up from his calculations, confused. What do you mean military construction? Missile bases, Kendall replied, spreading the photographs across Brennan's desk. SS-20 deployments. Your agricultural disruptions correspond perfectly with new strategic weapons facilities. The Soviets diverted resources to build these bases, and it showed up in their grain numbers before we could see it from space. What Kendall and Brennan couldn't have imagined was that they had stumbled onto an entirely new intelligence methodology. The Soviets had spent enormous effort concealing their missile deployments from American satellites. They built decoy facilities, used camouflage, conducted construction during periods of heavy cloud cover, and moved mobile launchers unpredictably to prevent tracking. But they couldn't hide the economic disruption caused by massive construction projects. Every missile base required tens of thousands of workers, millions of rubles in materials, and transportation infrastructure that competed with civilian economic activity. The Soviet command economy meticulously tracked everything, and those tracking numbers were published for the world to see. Dorothy Archer immediately grasped the implications. Within a week, she had expanded her team from 6 analysts to 23, pulling in economists, statisticians, and Russia specialists from across the intelligence community. They began systematically analyzing every category of Soviet economic data, not just grain production but coal output, cement manufacturing, electrical generation, railway transportation, petroleum refining, and steel production. Each data stream was mapped by oblast and cross-referenced with satellite imagery and signals intelligence. The technique Archer's team pioneered would later be called econometric intelligence, though in 1978 they simply called it finding the footprints. Every major military construction project left footprints in economic data. A new submarine shipyard required massive electrical generation capacity, which meant new power plants or diverted electricity, which showed up in regional consumption statistics. An aircraft production increase required aluminum and titanium, which meant smelting capacity diverted from civilian uses, which appeared in metal production reports. Tank manufacturing needed steel and chromium, petroleum refining supported military aviation, and railway transportation patterns revealed the movement of military equipment disguised as civilian freight. The irony was profound. The Soviet Union's commitment to central planning and comprehensive economic reporting, meant to showcase socialist efficiency, had created a vulnerability that capitalist intelligence services could exploit. The Soviets published data to demonstrate transparency and economic progress. They never imagined that American economists would use that same data to uncover their most closely guarded military secrets. By August 1978, Archer's expanded team had identified 17 additional locations showing economic disruption patterns consistent with military construction. Satellite reconnaissance confirmed 14 of them as active weapons facilities, 9 SS-20 missile bases, 3 new air defense radar stations, and 2 expanded submarine support facilities. 3 locations remained ambiguous, showing economic anomalies without clear satellite confirmation. The CIA tasked additional reconnaissance assets to those sites. Within 6 months, all 3 proved to be military-related: a signals intelligence station, a strategic command bunker, and a chemical weapons storage facility. General Marcus Webb, the 58-year-old director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, read the econometric intelligence reports with a mixture of excitement and dismay. Webb had spent 32 years in military intelligence, rising from a signals intercept analyst during the Korean War to become one of the Pentagon's most respected strategic intelligence officers. He immediately understood that the Soviets had been concealing the true scope of their missile deployments. "How many SS-20 sets are we missing?" he asked during an August briefing at Langley. Robert Kendall, who had become the primary liaison between satellite reconnaissance and economic analysis teams, consulted his notes. "Based on economic disruption signatures, we estimate between 85 and 120 additional SS-20 launchers beyond our previous count. That would put the total Soviet SS-20 force at approximately 250 to 300 launchers, not the 180 launchers we had previously estimated." Webb's jaw tightened. The SS-20 represented an existential threat to NATO. Each launcher carried 3 warheads, meaning the Soviets potentially possessed 900 nuclear warheads on intermediate-range missiles aimed at European targets. The strategic balance everyone thought they understood was fundamentally wrong. "Jesus Christ," Webb muttered. "We've been negotiating arms control treaties based on numbers that are completely inaccurate." The revelation sent shockwaves through the intelligence community. NATO military planners had based their entire European defense strategy on the assumption that Soviet intermediate-range missile forces numbered approximately 540 warheads. If the actual number exceeded 900, then NATO's tactical nuclear response capabilities were grossly inadequate. The calculations that defined flexible response doctrine, the war games that tested NATO readiness, the targeting plans that determined how many weapons would be allocated to counterforce missions, everything needed to be reconsidered. Admiral Stansfield Turner, who had become CIA director in March 1977, ordered a comprehensive review of all Soviet military estimates using econometric intelligence methods. Turner, a 54-year-old naval officer who had commanded carrier battle groups before taking the CIA position, understood the strategic implications immediately. He tasked Dorothy Archer with expanding her methodology across every category of Soviet military capability. "Want to know what else we've been missing?" he told her during a September meeting. "If grain statistics can find missile bases, what else can we learn from their published economic data?" Archer assembled a team of 67 analysts by October 1978. They received access to every Soviet economic publication the CIA had collected: five-year plan reports, oblast-level industrial production statistics, railway transportation data, electrical generation figures, coal mining output, steel production numbers, petroleum refining capacity reports, and hundreds of specialized technical journals that Soviet ministries published to demonstrate economic achievements. The analysts also gained access to reports from Western companies doing business with the Soviet Union, trade statistics from European governments, and shipping manifests from ports that handled Soviet cargo. The analysis team divided Soviet territory into a grid of 400 kilometer squares. Each square was assigned to a group of analysts who tracked every economic indicator for that region over a 10-year period from 1968 to 1978. They looked for anomalies, unexpected increases or decreases in production, transportation pattern changes, resource allocation shifts, and discrepancies between reported outputs and historical trends. Every anomaly was cross-referenced with satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and human source reports. The results astonished everyone. By January 1979, econometric intelligence had identified 63 previously unknown or mischaracterized military facilities across the Soviet Union. These included 22 additional strategic missile bases, 11 naval facilities, 9 air defense command centers, 7 military research laboratories, 6 nuclear weapons production facilities, 4 military electronics manufacturing plants, and 4 chemical weapons facilities. Each facility had left signatures in economic data, disrupted local production patterns, diverted transportation capacity, increased electrical consumption, or anomalous resource allocation. One particularly revealing case involved the city of Severodvinsk on the White Sea coast. Soviet publications reported that Severodvinsk's electrical consumption had increased 34% between 1975 and 1978, yet the city's population had only grown 3%. No new industrial facilities had been publicly announced. Economic analysts flagged the anomaly. Satellite reconnaissance revealed massive expansion of the Sevmash shipyard, where the Soviet Navy built nuclear submarines. The electrical consumption increase corresponded exactly with the power requirements for new submarine construction halls and associated metalworking facilities. Econometric analysis suggested the Soviets were building submarines at nearly twice the rate NATO had estimated. Subsequent intelligence confirmed that assessment. Thomas Brennan became something of a legend within the intelligence community. The economist who had worried about Ukrainian wheat harvests had inadvertently revolutionized strategic intelligence collection. He received the CIA's Intelligence Medal of Merit in a classified ceremony in March 1979. Admiral Turner personally thanked him. "You've given us a new way of seeing," Turner said, shaking Brennan's hand. "The Soviets can hide facilities from our satellites. They can encrypt their communications. They can compartmentalize information from human sources, but they can't hide the economic disruption their military programs create. Not when they're compulsive about publishing statistics." The econometric intelligence breakthrough had profound implications for arms control negotiations. The strategic arms limitation talks, which had produced the SALT II Treaty in June 1979, had relied on estimates of Soviet forces that were now known to be significantly inaccurate. The treaty's limits on strategic launchers and warheads had been negotiated based on flawed numbers. When President Jimmy Carter's national security team learned the true scope of Soviet missile deployments, enthusiasm for SALT II ratification cooled considerably. The Senate ultimately never ratified the treaty, and while Soviet SS-20 deployments weren't the only reason, they certainly contributed to congressional skepticism about Soviet compliance with arms control agreements. NATO's response to the SS-20 threat became one of the defining issues of the early 1980s. In December 1979, NATO adopted the dual-track decision agreeing to deploy American Pershing II missiles and ground-launched cruise missiles in Western Europe, while simultaneously pursuing negotiations to reduce intermediate-range missiles on both sides. The deployment decision sparked massive protests across Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people demonstrated against American missiles, convinced that NATO was escalating the arms race unnecessarily. What the protesters didn't know was that their governments had been shown econometric intelligence proving that Soviet missile forces far exceeded previous estimates. The NATO deployments weren't escalation, they were catching up. Dorothy Archer's Agricultural Analysis Division was quietly renamed the Econometric Intelligence Group in March 1980. The group expanded to 134 analysts and received funding to develop sophisticated computer models for analyzing Soviet economic data. They created algorithms that automatically flagged anomalies in production statistics, transportation patterns, and resource allocation. The models processed thousands of data points daily, identifying potential intelligence targets for satellite reconnaissance and human source collection. By 1982, econometric intelligence had become a standard component of the CIA's analytical toolkit, integrated into every major strategic assessment. The Soviets remained completely unaware that their published economic statistics were compromising military security. They continued issuing detailed 5-year plan reports, oblast-level production data, and industry-specific output statistics throughout the 1980s. Soviet planners believed transparency demonstrated socialist efficiency and economic progress. The KGB focused its counterintelligence efforts on preventing physical espionage, finding Western spies, detecting satellite reconnaissance, protecting military facilities from observation. Nobody in Moscow imagined that American economists were using grain export data to find missile bases. The intelligence breakthrough came at a critical moment in Cold War history. The Soviet Union's massive military buildup during the late 1970s had created genuine alarm in Western capitals. NATO leaders needed accurate assessments of Soviet capabilities to make informed decisions about defense spending and military strategy. Econometric intelligence provided that accuracy. It revealed that the Soviet threat was even larger than feared, but it also showed where the threats existed and how they were developing. Knowledge replaced speculation. Intelligence drove policy rather than assumptions. Years later, after the Cold War ended, Thomas Brennan would reflect on the March afternoon in 1978 when he first noticed that Ukrainian grain production didn't match the weather patterns. "I was looking at wheat statistics," he would tell audiences at intelligence conferences, "just trying to forecast Soviet grain imports, so our government could help American farmers sell their crops. I never imagined that a 23% drop in winter wheat production would lead to discovering hundreds of nuclear missiles pointed at Europe." That's the thing about intelligence. Sometimes the most important secrets are hiding in the most mundane data. You just have to know how to look. The econometric intelligence methodology pioneered by Archer's team influenced intelligence collection for decades. During the 1980s, similar techniques were applied to analyzing Soviet aerospace programs, naval construction, nuclear weapons production, and conventional military modernization. The methodology proved especially valuable for monitoring Soviet compliance with arms control agreements. When the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty eliminated all American and Soviet intermediate range missiles in 1987, econometric intelligence helped verify that the Soviets were actually dismantling their SS-20 forces. Economic indicators showed reduced activity at former missile bases, declined transportation of specialized components, and shifted resource allocation away from missile production facilities. The story of how grain statistics revealed missile deployments remained highly classified until the late 1990s. When details finally emerged through declassified documents and interviews with retired intelligence officers, historians recognized it as one of the Cold War's most innovative intelligence breakthroughs. The CIA had essentially invented open-source intelligence analysis decades before the Internet made such analysis commonplace. They had demonstrated that authoritarian governments, despite their obsession with secrecy, inevitably left traces of their activities in economic data. Those traces could be detected, analyzed, and used to construct accurate assessments of military capabilities. The irony that resonated most strongly was how the Soviets' commitment to central planning had undermined their security. A market economy would never publish the kind of detailed, comprehensive economic statistics that Soviet ministries produced routinely. Private companies don't report production figures to the government. Market prices emerge from supply and demand, not central planning committees. Transportation networks respond to economic incentives, not state directives. The very system the Soviets believed made them stronger, comprehensive planning and control, had created vulnerabilities that Western intelligence exploited brilliantly. General Marcus Webb later wrote in his memoirs that the grain data intelligence breakthrough taught him an essential lesson about strategic competition. "We spent billions of dollars building satellites that could photograph Soviet territory from space," Webb wrote. "We recruited spies at enormous risk. We intercepted communications using the most advanced technology in the world. All of that was valuable. But sometimes the most important intelligence comes from reading what your adversary publishes openly, if you're smart enough to understand what the data actually reveals. A 34-year-old economist with a background in agricultural statistics saw something that our satellite analysts had missed. That's humbling. It's also inspiring. It reminds us that intelligence is fundamentally about asking the right questions and having the creativity to look for answers in unexpected places. By the mid-1980s, econometric intelligence had become so integrated into CIA analysis that younger officers couldn't imagine how intelligence had been conducted without it. They grew up professionally in an environment where economic data was automatically cross-referenced with imagery, signals intelligence, and human source reporting. The methodology seemed obvious in retrospect. Of course, military construction disrupts local economies. Of course, those disruptions appear in production statistics. Of course, analyzing those statistics reveals patterns that indicate military activity. But in March 1978, when Thomas Brennan first noticed that Ukrainian wheat production had dropped without explanation, none of it had been obvious. It had required curiosity, persistence, and the intellectual courage to suggest that grain statistics might matter for strategic intelligence. The satellite photographs that confirmed Brennan's discoveries still exist in classified archives. High-resolution images showing Soviet missile bases under construction in forests and fields across the USSR. The economic reports that first revealed those bases, the grain export data, railway transportation statistics, and agricultural production figures, have been declassified. Researchers can now read the same documents Thomas Brennan studied in 1978, seeing for themselves how a 23% drop in winter wheat production in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast signaled something far more significant than a bad harvest. They can trace the analytical process that connected agricultural disruption to military construction, economic anomalies to strategic weapons deployments. What remains striking, even decades later, is how close the intelligence community came to missing the pattern entirely. If Brennan had accepted the initial explanation, statistical manipulation or Soviet bookkeeping errors, the anomaly would have been dismissed. If Dorothy Archer hadn't taken his analysis seriously enough to forward it beyond the Agricultural Analysis Division, nobody else would have seen it. If Robert Kendall hadn't bothered to cross-reference the economic data with satellite imagery, the connection would never have been made. Intelligence breakthroughs often depend on such contingencies, moments when someone decides to pursue an anomaly rather than dismiss it, when someone connects data streams that had never been connected before. The story also reveals something profound about the Cold War's nature. Both superpowers possessed nuclear arsenals capable of destroying civilization. Both maintained vast intelligence services dedicated to understanding the other's capabilities and intentions. Both invested enormous resources in secrecy and deception. Yet despite all the secrecy, all the classified programs and compartmented information, the truth kept emerging. Sometimes it emerged from satellite photographs, sometimes from intercepted communications, sometimes from brave individuals who risked their lives to pass secrets to the other side, and sometimes, remarkably, it emerged from publicly available agricultural statistics that nobody had thought to analyze carefully. The Cold War was ultimately about information: who had it, who could hide it, who could discover it, and who could use it to make better decisions. In that competition, Thomas Brennan's curiosity about Ukrainian wheat production mattered just as much as any satellite in orbit.